her ear is sharp, but like when I'm 4 feet away, right, the background is a lot more clear, the forefront is a lot more clear, the blankets in front is a lot more clear. So
Yeah, so
that's what you were looking for,
that's
right?
what I'm looking for. That's right. A change in how much space is in focus.
Okay.
I
Just making sure that because I think in your example you use like 8 feet or 6 feet or something away.
think it was 1 and 8. Yeah. Uh huh. That's right. And the focal length of the lens and the size of the aperture will also determine how much of a change there is. Um, so if you use a really large aperture and and a long lens, which will give you shallow depth of field,
Hmm.
then you will see shallower depth of field even when you're further back than you would if you had used a small aperture and a short lens, both of which will give you greater depth of field. So the three things affect each other.
I was also really amazed at the quality. Like I took a picture of a flower and I was able to zoom in on my computer all the way down to the little pistils where I see the pollen.
Isn't that amazing?
It was crazy actually.
Yeah, I know. You know what's amazing to me also is that phones, my when I do that with my iPhone,
Oh
it's
yeah.
so incredibly sharp. You know, like a close up of my cat's nose, and I'm amazed at how at the quality, of these and of just everyday not really expensive lenses, but the lenses that come with the cameras can give such incredible sharpness of stuff really close. I know I love that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the sales of cameras and whatnot have been going downhill a little bit. And that's
True.
primarily due to what smartphones are capable of doing.
That's right. Yeah, I noticed that a lot of YouTubers use their phones. I mean, it's so much easier, unless they're doing really intricate stuff like the craft people. I think a lot of them will set up a regular SLR camera to actually film what they're doing. But
Or
other
the
stuff seems to
camera.
be done with phones, you know. I'm
Yeah.
not I don't watch it that much myself. My daughter is a YouTube addict, and I am forced against my will to to watch some of this. It's actually amazing. People are so talented and apparently have I'm not talking about the professional YouTubers, but the ones who just do it kind of out of the goodness of their hearts to put instructional things up on YouTube. It's amazing. It's so helpful. But they have a lot more time, I guess, than I do to do that. Okay. All right. Sorry to keep going on about that. Um,
Motion.
motion. So yes, Baharak.
About sending the assignment, first assignment, aperture and something. I couldn't send as a one file or one folder.
Right.
I sent it to you separately, and I wrote my name under the each photo. And yeah,
Oh,
did you
good.
see
That's
that?
great.
It's good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh,
the assignments are all they were written for in class
yeah, I know.
submission. So I'm sorry, I should have changed that because it's true that Canvas, unless you zip, like I think even if you do zip
Yeah,
all of
actually, that's what
everything, it
I
just does
I
as
was struggling
individual
with the
files.
same problem.
That's great. Yeah. So in the future, I will change that. Just name each image as to what it is, as you did with
Yeah,
your
I
name.
know.
And yeah, I think we'll just have to go with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yes, you're
Thank
right.
you.
That is different than what I told you to do.
So,
Because
so you
yeah,
have to download a file called WinRAR in order to zip the file, just in case.
Okay, WinRAR, and there are a couple of others I think that.
Or 7-zip or
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Sure.
you don't you don't
I
have to do that. You can submit them individually, but you have to do it individually instead of zipping all of them and then just submitting that zip folder or
Yeah.
file, whatever it is.
Are you guys talking about the project that we submitted, the
Yes.
downfield?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, because I just managed to join the class and I lost it a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. So yeah, I did the same that as you just mentioned. So I submitted each photo separately, but I also sent you like the entire file on WeTransfer for to your email.
Okay. Oh, great. That's fine. So there's backup.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the quality is better. So
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, any questions, issues, comments before we get going? Nothing. I just normally, this of course is school, not not Sita's commentary on life, though that enters in some. I just want to address what's going on in our country right now because it's so pervasive, it's so and it's so terrible. So what I am referring to are the protests all across the country about the murder of George Floyd, and something I think that we can't ignore. Certainly because of the protests and the violence that has sprung from it, but also the cause, and that is a pervasive, sadly pervasive racism in our country towards not just towards people of color, not just blacks, but other minorities who don't fit into the quote mainstream white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group. And I think that it's something that is so ingrained in our society that many people aren't even aware of it. I don't know if you saw the film of that young woman in Central Park in New York City who was angry that he asked her to put her dog on a leash, and she threatened to call the police, which she did do, and she threatened him saying, I'm going to call, as a white woman being harassed by an African American man, and she did that, and she was in the wrong. So apparently she doesn't think of herself as racist, and yet what came out, her first reaction was to call the police and say a black man is harassing me, and to use that against him, to threaten him. She said, I'm going to call the police and tell them this. So, it's something that's so ingrained in many people, and we all have our own prejudices and our own biases, but I think it's kind of a wake-up call, I hope, for us to look at ourselves and what what really goes on in there. We can't always tell, but it's pretty scary to see this happening in our country. So I wanted to address that just briefly.
Actually, add on to that. When I was in downtown San Jose yesterday, it was most of the people there were peacefully protesting, and there's always the odd ones out in a protest. There's those peaceful and lawful protesters who stay on the sidewalk, or people who occupy the street, and then there's these idiots spraying spray paint on the walls, rioting stores. And there's people who bring chalk instead of spray paint. because they know it's erasable.
Right.
There's a bunch of different ideologies that go along. There's people who believe fuck the police, like they write FTP, and then there's people who know that not all police are bad,
Right.
and there's rotten eggs in each side of the group. So that's a lot of what I witnessed yesterday, but it just says more like everyone's got to take a look at themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. What really are our motives, you know? And I think it's really, really too bad that so many of the protests, you know, that looters and destructive people come along with the protesters, because then the attention goes to the looting, which is a terrible thing. And it doesn't belong, in my opinion, with protests. And also, it almost always affects the poor, you know, the store owners in those neighborhoods. Now, in these cases, they also went to Walmart and you know, Nordstrom's, so it kind of spread out. But often it affects the poor neighborhoods, businesses, rather than, you know, anything more effective, you might say. But it detracts attention from the meaning of the protest to, you know, to this destruction, and it unfortunately allows people to say, oh, look at that, you know, these protesters, all they want to do is loot and make trouble and destroy things. And that really is not the case for the vast majority of protesters. So
Actually, what I've been hearing recently was there was an undercover cop dressed in plain clothes, and he acted as a rioter to start rioting.
oh wow,
And so everyone's got different motives, taking advantage of the situation. Crazy stuff like that's always happening.
yep.
But it's eye-opening. I got to see it. Got to be a part of it. That was fun.
For the good and bad of it, right?
I
Yeah,
mean,
but eye-opening,
yeah,
I'm sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, on that note, right? uh, back to photography. So let me find my my slideshow. This should be it. Yes. So when we talked about using the aperture and the shutter together, when we talked about equivalent exposures, we talked about first the effect of the shutter, and then the effect of the aperture on our images. So let me just get us to that screen. So can you guys see these here? Okay, good. So we talked about equivalent exposures. And these are not the same equivalent exposures I showed you, but they are equivalent exposures. And we said that the larger the aperture, that is, the more light that comes in through the aperture, the less light will let in through the shutter. So with a large aperture, you use a fast shutter speed. And with a small aperture, so over here, f/16, that lets in much less light, we use a slow shutter speed that lets in a lot more light. And we said that we use fast shutter speeds to stop or freeze motion when there's something moving in front of the camera, and a slow shutter speed to show motion as a blur of motion. We then went on in the next lecture or so to talk about the effect of the aperture, and that was the first assignment. It's the depth of field assignment. So again, obviously, the size of the aperture affects how much of the frame is in focus from the foreground to the background. So a large aperture, which is a small f-stop number, gives us shallow depth of field, and the small aperture, a large f-stop number, gives us great depth of field. Now I want to go back and have us deal with motion. So I want to talk about motion and motion photography. So we'll look at some images dealing with motion. So let me bring that up. Can you guys see these horses? Or no? No, okay.
No, not yet.
All right. So okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the first motion studies that were done photographically were done in the 19th century, so about 150 years ago. And they were, the first ones that we know of were done by a man named Eadweard Muybridge. His real name was Edward Muggeridge. He was from England, but he changed his name to Eadweard Muybridge. I don't know why. And he came to the United States. What's that? Question?
Sorry, feedback.
Oh, okay.
Just feedback.
No worries. Just checking in there. Came to the United States sometime, I think, in the 1850s. And he was already a photographer, and he made some amazing images up in Yosemite and in the Sierra with using the big huge cameras that were used at the time. They were very difficult to use, and he was very good at it. He was friends with a man named Leland Stanford Sr., who was at the time governor of the state of California, and also the founder of Leland Stanford Jr. University. Stanford had a bet on with a friend of his, and this bet was that at some point during a horse's gait, at some time while the horse was running, all four hooves were off the ground. And Stanford said yes, they were, and Stanford's friend, whose name I don't know, said no, the horse's hooves never left the ground, all four together, that there was always at least one paw on the ground. So Stanford hired Muybridge to prove him correct. And Stanford owned racehorses, and he had his own racetrack in Palo Alto on what is now the Stanford University campus. And so Muybridge worked there to prove Stanford correct. And on the racetrack, he set up a series of cameras, and he strung a wire across the racetrack attached to the shutter release on each camera. So as the horse ran down the racetrack, it tripped each shutter. And so what you see here is an example of that. There are 16 frames, one at each point where the horse tripped the camera shutter. And so if you look in the upper strip, in the middle two images, you can see that all four hooves are in fact off the ground. And so Muybridge proved his friend Stanford right. Stanford won his bet. And Muybridge went on to do many, many more motion studies. So here is another one of a naked woman kicking a hat as she runs down a sort of track. And you can see it's much more detailed than the last set of images. Muybridge has photographed this woman from 3 different angles to show what her body looks like in motion at these different angles. Did she have to be naked? No, it was the Victorian era. You know, people were very uptight and prudish, and this was an acceptable way of looking at a naked woman's body, because of course it was for not quite scientific purposes, but something along those lines, so it was more acceptable. But at any rate, Muybridge made many, many different studies of motion. He invented something called the zoopraxiscope. And you can see this here. It says down here, zoopraxiscope. Copyright 1893 by Eadweard Muybridge. And what it is a series of still images that rotates. And if you see these slits here, there was a light behind it. So it gave a strobe effect, and it made it appear that this was a couple waltzing, dancing. And this is crazy. This is one of the cameras that Muybridge invented. I think it shows you something of his mindset. So this big rifle and this, what looks to be a magazine for bullets, is actually for the film. But that aside, there's a big story there, but I won't spend the time now. But anyway, Muybridge's motion studies were the basis for modern motion pictures. And in fact, there's another story about how his idea was stolen by Stanford and given to a couple of French brothers whose name was Lumière, and they were the people who invented motion pictures. And so they literally had the basis for that was Muybridge's work with still photography. And if you know about motion pictures, and most of us have an idea of motion pictures, you know that they're actually on film still images that are run together very quickly, that are seen very quickly, and make it appear as if things are moving. Right. Video is different. It's not, modern video is not quite the same, but with film, that's how it worked. So here, let's see if I can get that to go. Can you guys see this moving? So this is a set of still images, but when shown very quickly, makes it appear as if the subject is moving. Oops. Okay. So after Muybridge, certainly, and probably at the same time, but after Muybridge, many people did different types of motion studies. Another person doing motion studies was a man named Marais, I think Jean-Jacques Marais. Jean-Etienne. Anyway, I have to check his first name, sorry. Working in Paris. And he photographed motion in a different way. So instead of stopping motion with individual frames, he left the shutter open and used flash to illuminate the motion at different points. So here we see this man pole vaulting, vaulting himself over this barricade. And it looks as if there are many people doing this, but it's one person captured many times with the flash. And so Marais did a number of his own motion studies. This is a cat, poor thing, being dropped. So the people for the ethical treatment of animals would have something to say now, 130 years later. But it's known that cats can write, they write themselves. So if you drop the cat upside down, if it has enough time, that is not just dropping it a foot, but let's say 5 feet, it will flip its body around and land on its feet every time. And so this study shows how the cat does that by rotating the back of its body and the front and so on, and then landing with its legs straight, extended fully so that it can then take the pressure of landing. Obviously, if you drop a cat from 10 stories up, it will die, even if it does right itself. But given the correct or survivable circumstances, the cat will do this. And this was a great help, apparently, for neurological studies as to how this was done and why. And apparently, it was eventually discovered that cats' brains have something more akin to a gyroscope, so that they can orient themselves much more quickly than we do. Anyway. A wonderful example, I think, of motion, just of the upper body. So you can see this guy's face a little bit as he moves across. And the overlapping of the hands, I think, is really, really beautiful. And it looks to me almost like the images or statues of the Hindu god Shiva doing his dance, and he's portrayed as having many, many hands. And to me, anyway, that is a representation of motion, the way we see it here. And I think it's kind of amazing how still the man kept his legs while the upper body was...
This was a long exposure using flash?
Using flash, using repeated
Strobe?
flashes. Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
What
So,
was the shutter speed, do you think?
so it doesn't have a shutter speed. It was set to what we call bulb today, which is where the shutter is actually locked open, and it's done in a darkened area. So the flash exposes that same piece of film, in this case, repeatedly, as in this case the man moves across the frame. Right.
Do you think he moved slowly or quickly? Because I think if he would have moved faster, it would have been more blurred out, kind of like a wave.
Yeah, you're right. I would guess that. I mean, he wasn't like, but yeah, instead of going like that, he probably panned across more slowly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But given the relative simpleness of the equipment at the time, it's beautifully done. The timing is excellent here with the crossing over of the hands. So, and Marais also did some, many studies. So this image looks as if it's a herd of horses passing through the frame, and it's really just one horse that's exposed repeatedly. Right. Okay, a very different kind of motion study here. Not that I expect you guys to stop the motion of a bullet traveling faster than the speed of sound. These next images were made by a photographer named Harold Edgerton. His nickname was Doc Edgerton. And actually he was an engineering professor at MIT. And he was fascinated by speed, just obsessed actually with speed, and not just the sort of motion studies we had just seen, but the effects of very fast moving subjects on the surrounding area. So in this case, this bullet passing through an apple in literally the split second before it exploded. So it's impossible to photograph something like this moving at this speed with a mechanical shutter. So mechanical shutters, such as the ones in our cameras, have a maximum speed of maybe 1/10,000th of a second. And to capture this, you need maybe 1/100,000th of a second. And so Edgerton invented machines that would sense when the, in this case, when the bullet was fired, and then set off a strobe, a flash, at the exact split second when the bullet passed in front of the camera. So the camera and the light and the strobe were set at a distance, obviously, from the gun. And this machine that he built sensed when the bullet was fired and told the strobe when to flash in order to capture this. And Edgerton did hundreds, maybe thousands of different motion studies, and I think it's really interesting to see them. We don't have time to look at all of them, but here's a very early one of his, with the motion frozen just as this football player's foot, you can see it's a long time ago, judging by the clothing, hits the, as the toes make contact with the football, but in the instant before the football actually goes flying, and you can see the compression of the football around his toes, the force that the toes have on the effect of the force on the football in the instant before it goes flying. We all have our dreams, and one of Edgerton's was rather simple in some ways: to photograph a perfect corona or crown as a milk drop hits a countertop. And here's a series of images showing this one drop of milk hitting, and the force of that, of the fall forcing the fluid up into this crown and then subsiding. None of these show it perfectly, or not according to Edgerton. And this is almost perfect, but not quite. So you see this separation here between the outer little ball and the spike, and that was not okay. But this is perhaps the closest he came to a perfect crown or corona. This, anybody, any thoughts on what this is? Anybody? No.
Is that a balloon?
Looks like it, doesn't it? Kind of. It looks a little like a hot air balloon of sorts. It's actually an atomic explosion in literally the split second after it is detonated. So about 1/1,000,000th of a second after the detonation. Edgerton was hired by the Army to photograph their not nuclear at that time, atomic testing program. And so he built a camera that had a lens that was 10 feet long. So this image was made from 7 feet away, 7 miles away from the blast site. And he built a machine that sensed the X-rays that emanated from the bomb casing in the split second before detonation. So I don't know the mechanisms for detonating an atomic bomb, but apparently it produces some X-ray radiation. And Edgerton's machine sensed that and released the shutter, I guess, in this case, or yeah, it must have been a shutter of some sort, so that this could be recorded in that split, literally split second.
How far away did you say it was?
7 miles.
7 miles with a
7
10-foot
miles
lens?
with a 10-foot lens.
Holy shit, that's insane.
And you can see the tower that it was built on and the guide wires that are holding it in place, because it was determined early on that bombs are more effective if they detonate before they actually make contact with the ground. Otherwise, the ground absorbs a lot of the force. All of this terrible knowledge, right, on how to kill people more effectively. Anyway, Edgerton made many. What's so funny, Samuel?
While you said that, you said terrible knowledge. I was midway in a bite of my sandwich.
Right.
Just terrible timing. I'm sorry, continue.
Sorry. Okay. So Edgerton made many studies. He photographed many different detonations of atomic bombs. So I'm showing these almost as if they're in order. Each one is a different detonation, but here it's just the tiniest bit later. Maybe another 1/1,000,000th of a second after the detonation, and you can see this like lightning coming out where the guide wires were. And now the explosion has expanded to take all of that platform and scaffolding that held it up. And it looks almost like a living thing to me, more like a cell.
Kind of reminds me of the sun a little bit.
Which in a way it is, right? And here, further along, these tiny little shapes at the bottom are Joshua trees, just before they're vaporized by the explosion. So it gives you a sense of scale of this explosion. And again, you can see this lightning, like energy at any rate, coming out of the bottom of, from where those wires were. But the camera, and this is such an extreme example, of course, but the camera can show us things that we could never see. These things move so impossibly fast. All we ever see is a huge burst or flash of light. When an atomic or nuclear device is set off. And to be able to see things frozen as they occur is I think, amazing. And even, with the very basic motion studies of the horse running or, things captured in a way that we just don't see because we can't stop motion like that. Okay, so if you ever have a chance to look at Edgerton's work online or in books, it's really neat stuff. I'm showing you just the tiniest fraction of his work and of the things that he photographed moving. Hummingbirds, water, the effect of a bullet going through air, what happens to the air itself as things pass through. So anyway, obviously I don't expect you to to photograph, to stop bullets, or God forbid, nuclear explosions.
Oh no, that's my whole idea.
Dang! Curses foiled again. Okay. Well, we can. Some people say there's nothing new under the sun. We just repeat things, and that's fine.
Oh, I have a photo like this. This is a long exposure too, right?
Exactly. So this is a photograph of the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso drawing with light. He's drawn a minotaur, which is a mythical creature. And the image was made by a photographer named John Mealy, I think in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And this photographer, Mealy, had gone to a performance of ice skaters. And the ice skaters came out onto the ice in darkness, but each one carrying a candle. And so all you could see was the candles, the motion of the candles in figure eights or whatever designs that were made by the skaters, the formation of the skaters. And somehow, and I don't know exactly what Mealy's thought process was, but somehow he got it into his head that he would like to photograph Pablo Picasso painting with light. And so he happened to bump into Picasso, and I don't know how he managed to happen to do so, but he did, at a bullfight. And he introduced himself to Picasso and said, hey, I'd like to, obviously I'm paraphrasing, I'd like to photograph you. And Picasso said, well, here I am, go ahead. And then Mealy explained what he wanted to do, and Picasso became very interested. And they made a number of different motion studies with Picasso drawing, both in total darkness and then also being able to see Picasso. And so this, I think it's a very interesting way of photographing. Again, Mealy left the shutter open, without the shutter speed, just locked it open. And Picasso drew with a source of light, and you can just see at the very bottom, you can just see this little cord in his hand. So it's a cord with a little light bulb at the end. And of course, as you leave the shutter open, if there's anything moving, that motion is recorded as a blur. And so that's what the light does. It appears as a blur. But in the split second before Mealy closed the shutter, he popped off a flash. And so that's why we can also see Picasso himself and part of his studio, some of his artwork behind him. Had Mealy not popped off the flash, then we would just have seen the Minotaur, the light drawing without Picasso. And so that's what this is. A drawing, you can see a woman in profile, and you can see the light source down here. But since the flash was not popped off, we don't see the artist, we don't see Picasso.
That's actually something that I really want to try now, because I have a similar photo to the one that you're showing right now.
Mm-hmm.
This one right here.
Oh yeah, very nice. Uh-huh.
But the previous photo, it's just insane. Like you can do.
It's
like how did that even come up to him to turn on that strobe in the last second? That's so.
It's innovation, trial and error. Who knows? Maybe at some point, someone flicked a light on by mistake, and he was like, "I'm gonna kill you! You ruined my." And then it turned out to be this wonderful accident. I don't know. I'm making that up, but
I'm gonna have to try that.
Good. I hope so. I hope you guys all try lots of different things. As again, your next assignment is motion. And so, stopping motion and showing motion. Obviously, this is showing motion. And here's a photograph of the, at that time, very well-known classical violinist, Jascha Heifetz. And here you can see that the light source is coming from the side, but the front of the violinist, Heifetz. So Mealy attached the light to the end of Heifetz's bow, and so you have this wonderful motion, like a bizarre signature or some kind of polygraph test or a seismograph. Um, and we would not have known what it was. It's highly unlikely anyone would really have been able to tell what this was without being able to see the violinist as well. And the light is so beautiful too, the way the areas of light and shadow coming in. So yeah, I think it's just a very, very beautiful image, aside from this wonderful motion study. Just a moment. There. What do you think's going on here? Anybody? Anybody? Looks kind of like a slinky, doesn't it?
I think it's a light just spinning and spinning going around.
It is on a large scale. So yeah, it's on a helicopter. So this is a helicopter. I believe it's taking off. So helicopters, they go straight up, and then often if you see them, they do this scary looking little dip and then go straight up. So the rotors of the helicopter have lights on either end. And so you're seeing that motion really, really fast, obviously. And then there's also a light attached to the helicopter body, which is not in the same kind of motion. It's not rotating, so you see it as a straight line. And that shows the motion of the helicopter itself as it goes down and then up. And this is presumably the moon up here, which gives it it kind of balances the image. Not that you can necessarily tell that it's the moon per se, but it gives us a sense of in a way, of a frame, actually. So had that not been there, we would just have had this sort of wild slinky in the frame, But if you can see what happens here with the light, it's so beautiful, and the interactions, of the circles or arcs as they come around is just lovely and kind of amazing. It's like a beautiful spirograph.
It's pretty trippy because you can see where the light starts to fade
Mm-hmm.
on the top right portion.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where it starts to fade where we know that the helicopter body is.
Right. But we can't see it really. So, but it also gives us the sense of three dimensions, almost as if somebody had shaded it in on the sides, A different kind of motion study. This image is entitled Dali Atomicus, and so this is the Spanish surrealist painter Salvador Dali, photographed by a man who is very well known for his portraiture at the time, a photographer named Philippe Halsman. And Halsman made many, many portraits of famous people, but he was also interested in people jumping. And so he has a whole book called Jump, where he asked his subjects if they would jump for him after their formal portraits. And it's kind of interesting to see these people jumping and the way some of them jump. But anyway, this goes beyond that. This is a collaboration between Halsman and Salvador Dali. It's called Dali Atomicus because of this painting in the background that was entitled Leda, who is a mythical creature, subject, I guess, Leda and the Swan. So it's called Leda Atomicus. Anyway, this image, as you can see, shows a lot of motion going on. Dali himself jumping up in the air, the chair suspended, the actual the easels are up in the air, the paintings, these cats, poor things, and the beautiful arc of water, everything in the air at the same time. And so this took about 7 hours to do. And this was long before digital photography. So Halsman was using a large format still camera that used film. And so after each take, he'd have to go and develop the film to see if it came out. And then and then it hadn't. So they'd have to do it over and over. So hang on. So here are some of the failures. You can see Dolly either jumped too soon or is about to jump. The cats are not in the water. You know, it's just not quite there. Here's another one, and it says here that get this out of the way. Near misses included this one with one cat, which displeased perfectionist Halsman because the water, which splashed Dolly, also obscured part of his head. I love this, though. I think the interaction of the cat's body like this and Dolly is just amazing, this part here. But it was one of the failures. Another failure, the cat, oh my God, look at those poor cats. Met perfectly in midair, but the chair cut off most of Dolly's face. And then it says Dolly later filled in the blank frame on the easel. So in the final image, there's a painting in here. I don't know why they didn't just put it in to begin with. Everything went wrong with this one, in which two cats were badly aimed. The water was too little and too late, so it's just entering the frame. And Dolly jumped much too soon. So they had special handlers just for the cats, and you can imagine those poor cats, after hours of being tossed with water, must have been really unhappy. So this is actually the final take, and it wasn't perfect. You know, you could see the person's hands back here, and this person holding up the chair. You see the edges of the frame, you see shadows and so on. But I would guess they were like, okay, good enough. So you have this one cat caught beautifully in the arc of water as it comes across. It's just amazing. And Dolly's expression of, I don't know, almost like maniacal joy is incredible.
What shutter speed do you think they use for that? Or
I'm going to guess somewhere like 1/250th. That's my guess. You know, 1/125th to 1/250th to freeze the motion of the water and the cats. But it probably didn't have to be incredibly fast because they couldn't have been moving that quickly, you know. But here again is the final image, and you can see that the painting has been painted in, and the easel that was empty, and the man holding the chair cropped out, so the edges of the frame were cropped out. But again, a tremendous amount of work went into the creation of this image. So these next couple of images were made by a little boy named Jacques-Henri Lartigue. And he was given a camera around 1906 or 1910. And he grew up in an upper middle class or upper class family in Paris. And he was fascinated by motion, this little boy. And so you see his father or uncle tossing this poor dog across this little body of water. Again, with these, you know, probably people for the ethical treatment of animals might have had something to say. But you can also see that the shutter speeds of the cameras of the time were fast enough, even though this was more than 100 years ago, to freeze motion. So this dog is frozen midair rather than being a blur of a white blur going through the frame. I love this image. This is Lartigue's older cousin, whom he convinced somehow to jump down these stairs. And it's almost as if she's a witch, isn't it? Like flying on a broomstick. But then I also can imagine that the poor woman like did a terrible face plant. She came down. I hope not. But imagine jumping like that in these long, in a long skirt. But anyway, I think it's a wonderfully captured image. And this one of the tennis great Suzanne, we pronounce it here Lenglen, but if you ever watch the French Open, the tennis French Open, which of course all this stuff is canceled this year, one of the major courts at the French Open is named for her, Suzanne Lenglen. But obviously at that time, you could come in a lot closer to people. There was no security then. And so little Lartigue, who was maybe 10 years old, captured this wonderful photograph of her leaping to get this tennis ball. You can see the tennis ball is moving faster than she is because it's a little bit blurry. But she's frozen midair. And I think look at, she's got like a turban on her head. It looks as if she has this big feather coming out of it. I think it's a tree frond behind, but I think for me what makes the image also is this wonderful shadow of her beneath her, and it really shows her height and just, yeah, wonderfully captured image.
It's like the tennis version of Jordan's.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Sports photography, right? And check out the shoes she's wearing. No fancy Jordans here. They're just they were called espadrilles, very early versions of kind of casual wear, and they're strapped up kind of like a ballerina, A much more traditional motion study here, this made by the American photographer Ansel Adams, and we saw a couple of his images for depth of field. And this image, I think, is really interesting in that it both shows motion and stops motion. So these blurry areas here look as if somebody took the smudge tool in Photoshop and just kind of smoothed it out. But then in other areas, the motion is frozen. And this is because the water is moving at different speeds in different areas. So I don't know what shutter speed Ansel Adams used for this. I'm going to guess maybe 1/15, an eighth of a second, 15th of a second. In the areas where the water is sharp, it was moving more slowly. In the areas where it's blurry, it was moving more quickly, and so it appears as a blur. This is an image by a photographer named Paul Caponigro of white deer passing through the frame. And I think that, at least for me, and I think for Caponigro, the slight motion is what makes it such an effective image. Had they been frozen, we would kind of say, oh yeah, neat, white deer. But the sense of them passing through the frame, I think, really adds a different dimension to the image, of this herd moving. Why? We don't know why they're moving. Did something scare them? In a way, it doesn't matter, but the motion of them against the still trees, I think is really, really beautiful. So this image, made by a photographer named Tim Hearsum, and you can see it was made in Baghdad, but this is Baghdad, California, not Baghdad, Iraq. Who knew there was a Baghdad, California? I didn't anyway. But it appears that in this image, it appears anyway that Baghdad consists of one palm tree. Presumably there's more to it than that, but not so far as we can see. And obviously the main thrust of this image is the train passing through the frame. So the image was made with a relatively long shutter speed so that we have the train completely blurred as it passes through, and a beautiful use of perspective going back in the frame. But what we see here is a reflection on the windows of what's opposite. And it's almost as if we can see through the train windows to what's on the other side. You know, as if we have a window literally through to see what's there. And again, it's actually reflection, but it's beautifully done. The use of motion, I think, is just kind of amazing here. And the train, you don't even necessarily know that it is a train, though you can see the train tracks here, which is also kind of amazing. So the wheels are moving so quickly that they don't remain in place long enough for us to see them. So a few more images. These next images made by a British photographer named Michael Kenna. This image was made on the French coast near Normandy, and we would have no idea how large, how tall these waves are, but for this railing here. And that just shows us the enormity of these waves. So this fence or the railing is maybe 3.5 feet high, you know. So for me, I'm 5'4", and they'd be kind of waist level. So yeah, no more than 4 feet high. And which, you know, shows us that this is, you know, this wave is probably 25 feet high, about to break over this, the railing. And you can see that a fast shutter speed was used.
Probably, I will tell you the setting and you don't really need to.
I'm sorry? Would you say that again? Hello?
Sorry, I had my mic on mute. Sorry. I was talking to my...
Oh, okay. All right. So you can see here, oops, get back. A fast shutter speed was used because you can see all of these individual drops of water, you know, the spray of the water as it moves across, you know, yeah. So anyway, yeah, very fast shutter speed used. I don't mean like 1/5000th, but, you know, probably 1,000th of a second here. This image also made by Michael Kenna. It's called the Upset Chair. It was made in Florida. And a very long shutter speed was used. And what appears to be a fog bank here is actually the surf at the coast and the breaking waves over a long period of time. So maybe an hour, made in the middle of the night. And over that long period of time, the light accumulated so you can see the horizon, and it's bright above it. So there's probably some city or somewhat an urban area there. But again, the motion of the water over time just kind of accumulated to make it appear as if there's a fog bank. And this chair, this one turned over or upset chair, acts kind of like a visual anchor in the frame. It's not moving, and so it kind of holds the rest of the frame in place in a way. And here's another image with motion. So in the foreground, again, the breaking surf accumulating over time, looking like a cloud bank. There's this little mooring post, and you can, I think, just make out that there's something moored there attached that's moved back and forth over time, probably a little boat. You can just make out the horizon here. Obviously, this area is not quite as inhabited as the last one because it's also a long exposure, but we don't have a big, great accumulation of light here. But we have this wonderful line of light coming into the frame and just ending. And so that was an airplane that flew in at some point over this long exposure, flew into the frame, and then did a really sharp bank to the right along the coast, perhaps, and then exploded and fell out of the sky. No, I'm just joking. That is the point at which the photographer, Kenneth, closed the shutter. So he could have allowed, the shutter to remain open and the airplane to continue on, but then he would have had this shape here, that both entered and left the frame and would kind of pull our eyes out of the frame. And so by ending it here, he contains the image and also creates a certain amount of tension or question as to what happened, why this line just stops. This is made at one of the nuclear power plants in England, Sunderland, I think. And it was made over a period of time, as I think you can see. These are the cooling towers of the nuclear power plant, and you see the steam coming out, and that kind of gathers over time and becomes pretty diffuse. And these streaks of light are star trails. And it looks as if they have moved over time. What is actually happening is that with a long exposure, the Earth's motion is recorded. So what we're seeing is the Earth's motion relative to the stars. So the stars don't move in a way that we can see, but we move. And so they become like these streaks of light, almost like a little meteor shower. These, if you look here, these dots, I don't know, they're kind of faint, but that trail was made by an airplane passing through the frame, and what we're seeing, airplanes have strobes going, and that's what we're seeing going across the frame here. And an even longer exposure here, just beautiful. This one made in Rancho San Carlos in California, and a very, very long exposure, so that these star trails really do look like this amazing meteor shower captured. And you can see that the photographer, Michael Kenna, purposely put this naked tree in the middle of the frame. He certainly didn't have to. And the frame could just have been about the star trails. But he chose to place this right in the middle of the frame. And it really gives us a sense of where we are. And in a way of what's happening relative to us in a way that we can, so how should I say, so that we're kind of placed in the frame. We have an understanding of where we are and what's going on behind that, beyond us. So beautiful example of a very long exposure. So I think that's, oh, well, there are a few more. Might as well finish. So this image was made by an American photographer named Joel Meyerowitz, and it shows this hammock, presumably blowing in the wind, and it's a kind of evocative image. It gives us the sense of being there, of the breeze, of summer. But if you look closely, you'll see that although this hammock is moving, none of the grass is. The grass is all sharp. And so my guess is that he or someone spun the hammock and he photographed it. Because if it were windy enough to really blow the hammock in that way, then one would think that all of this grass would have been blowing as well. But anyway, the image, I think, is meant to give us this sense of summer, of the water, of a boat here, and just being out and so on. This image was made by a photographer, an American photographer named Sally Mann, whose work was very controversial. She photographed her children, and they were often nude or in positions that people felt were suggestive, sexually suggestive, or some people felt it bordered on pornography, and that was the religious right who objected strenuously to her work. She was also the recipient of several National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities grants, and there was some uproar among the religious right as to federal money, these federal grants going to work that these people considered to be almost pornographic. And she was not the only photographer whose work was objected to on those grounds, though not of the same type of photography. But anyway, her work was controversial, and she became very well known because of it in some ways. This image shows her son out in a body of water, and she used a large 8x10 view camera. And many of her images are almost like snapshots in a way, just showing the life of her children. But she actually went out into the middle of this stream or river with her big 8x10 view camera to make the image. And I think it's a very beautiful image. The lighting is lovely. It really is used beautifully to isolate the boy from the rest of the area. The background is dark, but you have a sense of what it is. But what I think is really, really amazing about the image is that you wouldn't know that the water was moving at all, except for the boy's presence in it. He breaks up the stream of water, and we see that the water is actually moving. And this beautiful placement of his hand, just lightly on the water is enough to break up the motion and show us that the water is actually moving. So behind him, it looks very still. It could just be a little lake or a little pond. But this is what shows us that he's actually standing in moving water, and it's his presence that breaks it up. This image is made by a photographer, relatively local photographer named Morley Bear. No, wait, not Morley Bear. Win Bullock, sorry. And he worked around the Central Coast in the Point Lobos area, down around Carmel. And this image appears to be what? Kind of like maybe a Central American rainforest, with the mist coming into the canyons and palm trees on the top. And it's actually just a small area. It's entitled Sea Palms, and it was made down around Point Lobos. And what we're seeing is the tide. It's a tidal pool, essentially, with the water going in and out and in and out over a long period of time. So the moving water ends up looking like mist. And we can see some of the motion here in the foreground of these little sea palms. And that's where the water actually hit them and they moved. But it's, I think, a wonderful example of how we can manipulate scale and be completely fooled by it, by the image, and think we're seeing something that's enormous and it's really tiny, or seeing something as if it's tiny and it's really enormous. So the camera can do amazing things. Okay, so I think we can stop at this point. I think we have a good sense. Oh, well, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to go on. I just have to, because there are a few more really good ones. So sorry. Can you still see this? So this is by a Brazilian photographer named Sebastião Salgado, who's done some amazing work in many different areas, and he photographs changes of people, like huge changes in populations, workers, and so on. And here, this image was made in Bombay or Mumbai, India, and the shutter speed is just slow enough so that we see this blur of motion. And so it's as if this mass of people is coming right at us. It's just kind of incredible. And actually, they're probably not all running, and, it's not actually a mob, but people getting off of these, on and off of the trains, in the train station. But the use of the slower shutter speed is so effective here, and it's not so slow that they're just a blur. We really have a sense that these are people, moving, but it gives the appearance of them coming right at us and moving very quickly, which is not necessarily the case. What's that? Comment, somebody?
No, I was just saying that I have one of his books here, and it's just amazing.
Oh, all right. Which one do you have?
Let me see the name. It's been a while.
Maybe Workers or...
Let me just see.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think his work is amazing. He's just an amazing photographer, and I think I have one of his movies assigned for you guys to watch a little bit later. He has just done some amazing work.
It's Genesis.
Genesis. Okay, so a later one. Very good. Yeah, I think he's fantastic. And this is, what's that? Yeah, I would guess somewhere around a 15th, maybe. Yeah, I don't know, but that's my guess. What I think is beautiful also is how sharp the actual trains are, really showing the contrast between still and moving areas.
But it does the same with the signs as well, too.
The signs, yeah, the cigarette signs, the advertisements.
The numbers on the trains.
Everything's so sharp. So here's another motion photograph that is in some ways similar in that it shows a mass of people moving. But in this case, the shutter speed is so slow, or slow enough, that really they are just blurred. And you can see a few hands that remained in place longer on this railing. But aside from that, it's like this sea of humanity. So this image was made in Moscow, in Russia. Why am I blanking on the photographer's name? It will come back to me. He's done some amazing black and white, mostly black and white work using motion. So in this case, the people are going. It's kind of doesn't sound right, but they're going up into a subway station. They go up and then they have to go down. But it kind of de-emphasizes any individuality even more in some ways than this, because here we at least see that they are, they've got bodies and heads, and here we don't. It's just this mass of motion. And here we have a newspaper vendor, magazine newspaper vendor, who's blurry, and so it's almost as if he's become, and I think it's a he, could be a she, a ghost, because over the long exposure, his body, especially his head, is moved, his hands, so he's a little bit more indistinct. And what is in focus, the newspapers, magazines, and especially this distressed, damaged wall behind him, make him even more indistinct and not quite real, not quite there. He's kind of transient relative to the sharp areas.
How do we know that he's a newspaper vendor?
Well, because of the newspapers, and he's standing with them and behind them. Or sitting, actually. He may be sitting on the stool.
My first glance was, I thought he was homeless.
Mm-hmm. I can certainly see that, yeah.
In some kind of symbolic way, like, since all the news and all the press and all the or what I see as a man all the news and whatnot is the things that we see that are visible. But if we were to take the guy as a homeless man, then it kind of emphasizes that we don't see them very often. We ignore them, or they're the invisible. At least that's how I interpreted it at first.
Mm-hmm. I certainly see what you're saying. The only reason I shouldn't say the only, but the reason I think he's the vendor is that he's behind them. Do you know what I mean? Rather than next to them, kind of like also there. But regardless, I think homeless or not, it shows his transientness, relative to what's there, that he is not very distinct, not as much of an individual or as real as these things around him, and the press
on the news. Yeah.
If you think, either the what's going on, or the lying press, or whatever, that's reality, and then the reality of this wall that's been damaged and seen the passages of time and so on, but it's real, it's there, it's solid, it's sharp, and the human, the person there is not.
It's the reality versus the reality is blurred, and the news is what's present and clear.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one interpretation. We all bring our own stuff to whatever we experience, and we interpret, it all goes through our filter, right? So if somebody else, one of you or someone else has had a completely different experience in life, or not even completely, but a different experience in life, you may experience this image in a different way. So, for example, you saw it as a homeless person, and I can certainly see why you did. I didn't see it that way for whatever reasons. And that could also have been the title, and I don't remember even if there is a title to
It
this.
could have just been left for interpretation as well.
And that's true, yeah. And that's, I think, how most photographers expect us to do, you know, what they expect us to do. We interpret their images as we will. Now, they direct us. You know, we're directed to see certain things. If the photographer is really, really determined that we experience it in a specific way, maybe he or she will include text. You know, even in the image, there are some photographers who actually write text on or right below their images. So you cannot, once that is there, you can't really interpret it in a different way. You know? But generally, we are left within certain bounds. We're left to interpret images through our own filters. Right.
Peter, can I just ask you something? Are you recording this lecture?
I am indeed, and I meant to tell you, I have had so much trouble getting these recordings loaded, so it is recording, and they will appear at some point, but they're such big files that I've been having a lot of trouble getting them.
Are you able to adjust the frame rate or some of the settings, the quality that it's recording at, maybe?
I have to check that. Generally, it's supposed to be shown at, I think, 720, which is good enough so it looks okay, but not such high quality that it like takes 3 hours to load. But
it did MP4?
Yes.
Huh.
Yeah. So I will keep trying, but they will be there eventually, I swear. Okay, just have to show you my favorite soccer player who retired last year, Arjen Robben, who played for Bayern Munich. So these obviously examples of stopping motion. And I love the goalkeeper's expression. It's like, oh my God, it's coming right at me. There's nothing I can do. It's also, I think, a great example of the use of a really long lens. And so we get the shallow depth of field, but we also get this compression of space. So it's hard to tell how much actual distance there is between the guy kicking the ball, Arjen Robben, and the goalkeeper. It looks as if maybe there's 3 feet. And that actually is not the case. It's probably more like 20 feet. But the use of the long lens compresses the space, so it's hard to tell how much actual distance there is between the foreground and in this case, the midground. So this is probably right before the ball is kicked because the ball is frozen, but his foot is moving. It's blurry. And I would think that had he already made contact with the ball, you'd see more motion on the ball and less of his foot. But anyway, a beautiful shot captured midair with a really fast shutter speed. I love this one. It's hilarious. So obviously, in the split second after the ball hit this player, Fellaini's, right after it hit his face, and the incredible distortion of what happens to his face after the ball hits it is kind of horrific, but amazing, and also kind of funny. But you can also see like the sweat or the water coming off the ball and the motion of the ball. So So sports photography, which almost always, though not always, but almost always uses fast shutter speeds. Now, sometimes slow shutter speeds are used to give a sense of motion, but most often they want to capture this. So this is this amazing header during the 2014 World Cup. So this is the Dutch player Robin van Persie doing this amazing header. And again, you see the very shallow depth of field because fast shutter speed was used, and in order to do that, a large aperture had to be used, which gives shallow depth of field, plus a very long lens, because obviously the photographer was not right out there on the pitch next to Robin van Persie, but way back with all the other press photographers using a really long lens to get this shot. And of course, long lenses also give us shallow depth of field. And one last motion showing the North Star here, Polaris. And so with Polaris, Polaris won't move relative to us because it's pointing, it's due north. But everything else, we rotate relative to that. So everything else, all the other stars look as if they're rotating around the North Star. Okay, that's enough, I think. All right. You've had more than your fill of motion images. Though I could go on and on and on, because there's, in any field of photography, there are so many amazing shots to show you. But you guys are probably like, "Gunk. Okay, that's enough." So next time we'll take a look at some of your depth of field images. They'll all be graded by then. If you're still getting them in, so be it. That's fine. Obviously, I hope for your homeworks, your assignments to come in sooner rather than later, but I also know that this is a very odd time for all of us. But anyway, we'll do that next week. And your next assignment, which I will post, is a motion assignment, which will probably be due next Monday, and I will post that as well. So the assignment to be posted is to make 6 images. So 3 sets of 2 images. In the first set, you'll photograph a moving subject twice, the same moving subject. One time freezing the motion, the second time showing the motion. In the second set, you will show one image showing motion, another stopping motion, but they don't have to be of the same thing. And in the third set, we will do what I apparently don't have here right now, something called panning. And I will post images showing panning, and that is following the subject, the moving subject, with your camera as it moves. So your camera is moving at the same rate as the subject, and you release the shutter as you move and follow the subject. So the effect is having the subject sharp because you're moving at the same rate. But the background will be blurry because you have moved the camera relative to the background. So it's blurry, but the subject will be sharp. And I will post images for that. Hang on one sec. Let me just see if I can bring up. Photography. No, photography. Okay. Just one moment.
Hey, Sita, I have a quick 5 minutes. Do you mind if I leave class a little bit early?
Oh, no, if you have to leave, of course. Of course. Absolutely. And I will post images for this, but I'll just show those of you who are here quick example of panning. So as you can see, these examples that came up on Google are almost all vehicles. So there's this beautiful one here of a tiger running, and you can see the tiger is sharp in places, but not entirely, and that's because certain areas of the tiger are moving faster than others. But the background is blurry because the camera has moved relative to it. So, with respect to these motion images, I know the guys will be unhappy about this, but I prefer that you not photograph cars, especially stopping motion. And here's why. Because when you stop the motion of a car, it looks like a parked or stopped car. Okay? It's really boring. And I've seen hundreds and hundreds of images of moving cars ostensibly in motion that just look like a stopped car. So if you're going to do that, I challenge you to make it interesting. Because if it's not, I warned you that I don't want to see that. Okay? Now, panning is different. Oops.
Excuse me.
Yeah? Question?
So the second part of the homework requires to like one subject and one object.
So it's a three-part assignment. So 3 different settings or 3 different moving subjects. Oh, does that make sense?
Yes. So basically, it's like 4 subjects and 1 object. What do you mean by object? Like,
I'm not sure what you mean by object.
So subject, it considers both a person and a object, right?
Yeah, subject is just the subject of the picture. It doesn't have to be a person necessarily.
That's right. It doesn't have to be a person. It's up to you. So here's a duck, right? And here is some other kind of bird. So in this case, panning was used following the duck as it flew. So the background is blurry in motion, if that makes sense, as opposed to not that one. This image, where the motion is frozen, but the camera was still. Does that make sense? Oh, that's cool. So you don't have to photograph a person or a vehicle, anything moving. As you can see, these examples on Google are almost all have humans involved, with the exception of this beautiful tiger here. But here's a little motor rickshaw, and and I hope that you'll experiment and try lots of different settings and subjects and see what you get. Obviously, I don't necessarily expect you to find a cheetah running across your frame here in California, though you never know what you'll find, right? But I hope that you'll experiment with different subjects, your friends, your family, rope them in, make them help you, have them jump up in the air. So in some ways,
I wanted to, if I wanted to incorporate movement and stillness in one photo, is that possible for one of the sets?
Absolutely. So you have things moving at different speeds. You have something moving really fast and another thing moving slowly, and one thing will be frozen and another will be blurry. Or do you mean by using the Picasso?
Like something like this one, with the violinist staying still, but the light moving.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, the violinist was still, except for the bow moving, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, absolutely. That would be great. I hope you experiment like with long exposures with light. That's great. Absolutely. Yeah. And I will post more examples, especially of panning, of moving the camera along with your subject. The trick there is to use a slower shutter speed, maybe a 30th of a second, depending on the speed of the subject. But you'll need to experiment, and that's the great thing about digital photography is that you get instant feedback. So you don't have to wait till you've developed your film to see what you got and then go back and do it again. Right. Okay, any questions? Comments? Issues? No? Nothing? We're all good? Okay, well, again, I will post these later, the panning images and the assignment. I think may already be posted, but I will make sure of that. And the next time we'll take a look at some of your images from the depth of field assignment as well. Okay. Okay, well, have a delightful week and weekend, and email me your questions. If you have them, I will have an office hour. It will be a little shorter. In fact, I probably move it up, like an hour. I have to take my mother to the doctor on Wednesday, so I will have my 2 office hours, but it'll probably be like 11:30 to 1:30 instead of 12:30 to 2:30. So it will be here on Zoom. I think I emailed everyone that invitation, but I'll post it on Canvas, so it's there for everybody. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Have
All
a
right.
wonderful week and weekend. Take care.
Thank
Make
you.
lots of images, and stay safe and healthy.
Bye bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.